What is happening to Israel right now is not a public relations problem. It is not a communications failure. It is not even primarily a military problem, though the military dimensions are significant. What is happening to Israel right now is a structural geopolitical collapse unfolding in slow motion. And it was entirely predictable because it follows patterns that have appeared in every era of history when a regional power loses the protection of its imperial patrons' legitimacy. I told you this would happen. I told you 18 months ago that the military campaign in Gaza, whatever its tactical outcomes, would produce strategic isolation of a kind that Israel had never experienced before. That prediction has materialized, and now I am going to tell you something more precise, more uncomfortable, and more consequential. I am going to predict country by country who abandons Israel next. And I am going to explain the structural logic that makes each of those abandonments not merely possible, but inevitable. Let me explain the framework before I give you the predictions, because the framework is what allows you to evaluate them. Israel's strategic position for the past 50 years has rested on three interdependent pillars. The first pillar is American diplomatic protection. The unconditional veto at the United Nations Security Council, the political cover that allows Israel to conduct military operations without triggering the international legal consequences that other states would face. The second pillar is American military supply, the $3.8 billion in annual military assistance, the resupply agreements that were activated during the October 2023 conflict, and the security guarantees that deter the most extreme forms of regional confrontation. The third pillar is Arab state normalization. The Abraham Accords framework, the quiet intelligence sharing arrangements with Gulf states, the economic integration that was supposed to make Israel an inseparable part of the regional economic architecture. All three of these pillars are now simultaneously degrading. That is the structural reality that makes what follows not prediction, but inevitability. We will examine four dimensions tonight. First, why the isolation has already progressed further than official narratives acknowledge. Second, the economic abandonment trajectory. Which countries are quietly decoupling from Israeli financial and trade relationships? Third, the diplomatic abandonment sequence, specifically which American allies are preparing to break ranks and in what order. And fourth, the critical question of whether the third pillar, Arab state normalization, survives and what its collapse means for Israeli strategic positioning over the next decade. Here is what you need to understand about how far the isolation has already progressed. When the International Court of Justice issued its preliminary ruling in January 2024, finding it plausible that Israel was committing acts that could constitute genocide, something structurally significant happened that received less analytical attention than it deserved. The case was brought not by a traditionally anti-Israel state, not by Iran or Syria, but by South Africa, a country that carries within its institutional DNA the memory of being on the receiving end of a regime that the international community eventually determined to be fundamentally incompatible with the norms of civilized governance. South Africa's decision to bring that case was a signal from the global South that had nothing to do with anti-Semitism and everything to do with the perception that the rules-based international order, the order that America claims to champion, applies selectively based on strategic alignment rather than actual principles. That perception, once formed at institutional scale, be difficult to reverse. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. This was unprecedented. No Israeli official had ever been subject to international criminal warrants before. And here's the structural implication that matters most. Every country that is a signatory to the Rome Statute, which includes most of Europe, is now legally obligated to arrest Netanyahu if he sets foot on their soil. The diplomatic consequences of this legal reality are still being processed, but they are not small. They mean that Israel's prime minister cannot visit most of Europe without triggering a constitutional crisis for the host government. That is not isolation at the rhetorical level. That is isolation built into the legal architecture of the international system. Now, let me walk you through the economic abandonment trajectory. The economic relationship between Israel and its trading partners is more fragile than it might appear on the surface. Israel's economy, with a GDP of approximately $520 billion, is deeply integrated into global trade and financial networks. But that integration creates exposure, and the exposure is being systematically exploited by a wave of economic disengagement that is happening quietly below the level of official policy announcements in the decisions of pension funds, university endowments, logistics companies, and multinational corporations that are concluding that Israeli commercial relationships carry reputational and legal risks they are no longer willing to absorb. The boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which spent 15 years in the margins of mainstream discourse, has in the past 18 months achieved a degree of institutional legitimacy that would have seemed impossible before October 2023. Major pension funds in Norway, the Netherlands, and Sweden have divested from Israeli defense companies. University endowments at dozens of institutions across the United States and Europe have faced sustained pressure campaigns that have produced divestment commitments. The Irish Parliament passed legislation restricting trade with Israeli settlements. These are not fringe movements anymore. They are indicators of a shifting mainstream consensus that is moving against Israel at institutional speed, slowly, but with the kind of structural momentum that does not reverse easily. The most significant economic abandonment, however, is not coming from the West. It is coming from the Global South's redirection of trade and diplomatic capital away from relationships with Israel and toward relationships with parties hostile to it. The Abraham Accords promised a future in which Israel was economically integrated into the region. Pipelines, trade routes, tourism flows, financial services. The future described here is one in which the assumptions underlying recent Middle Eastern diplomatic and economic realignments begin to weaken rather than expand. In this framing, the optimism that once surrounded frameworks such as the Abraham Accords is treated as having depended on a set of conditions that are no longer stable. Limited political salience of the Palestinian issue in global civil society, a relatively predictable alignment between U.S. foreign policy and regional normalization, and the expectation that economic integration would steadily outrun political conflict. The argument is that these foundations have been disrupted, and that as a result, the anticipated long-term economic dividends, often estimated in the hundreds of billions in potential trade, investment, and technology exchange, have not fully materialized in the way early proponents expected. From this perspective, some observers point to a visible pattern of diplomatic strain emerging across different regions, though the significance and permanence of these moves remain contested. A number of states in the Global South have, at various points, reduced diplomatic engagement with Israel or recalled envoys in response to political and humanitarian developments. Supporters of the systemic isolation thesis interpret these actions not as isolated reactions, but as early indicators of a broader recalibration driven by domestic public opinion and shifting global norms. However, others caution that such steps are often reversible, symbolic, or tied to specific events rather than representing a coordinated or irreversible geopolitical trend. The argument then extends to parts of Europe, where internal political pressures are described as increasingly influential in shaping foreign policy debates on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In this view, countries with strong domestic civil society movements, historical narratives of colonialism or resistance, and growing parliamentary polarization may experience rising pressure to adjust the level or tone of diplomatic relations. Analysts who hold this position often highlight states such as Ireland and Spain as examples where public opinion, legislative signaling, and party politics could gradually push foreign policy toward more critical postures. At the same time, institutional constraints such as European Union, consensus mechanisms, trade interdependence, and long-standing diplomatic frameworks are seen as moderating forces that make abrupt policy shifts unlikely. A particularly important structural factor in this discussion is Germany's long-standing position as a key diplomatic and security partner of Israel within Europe. Some analysts suggest that while Germany's foundational post-World War II commitment to Israeli security remains intact, generational change, evolving political discourse, and periodic policy disputes may gradually introduce more conditionality into that relationship. This is not typically understood as a break, but rather as a slow recalibration in which historical responsibility remains central, yet no longer functions as an absolute constraint on policy debate. The analysis then turns to the broader question of regional normalization frameworks, such as the Abraham Accords. These agreements are often described as having successfully established formal diplomatic and economic ties between Israel and several Arab states, reshaping regional alignments. However, critics of their long-term durability argue that they were premised on the assumption that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict would remain politically contained. In this interpretation, renewed conflict intensity and heightened global attention to Palestinian political status have increased domestic sensitivity in Arab states, making further normalization, particularly with major regional actors, more politically complex. Even where formal relations remain intact, some analysts suggest that deeper economic integration and strategic coordination may proceed more cautiously than originally envisioned. Within this framework, Gulf states that maintain relations with Israel are often described as balancing external strategic partnerships, economic modernization goals, and internal public opinion. The result, according to this view, is not necessarily diplomatic reversal, but a more managed and restrained form of engagement. Cooperation in areas such as technology, intelligence, and trade may continue, but under increased political scrutiny and reduced visibility. The broader regional normalization project is therefore characterized not as collapsed, but as slowed and politically constrained. At the systemic level, this line of analysis situates these developments within a three-pillar model: US, diplomatic backing, military and security cooperation, and regional normalization frameworks. The central claim is that each of these pillars is facing varying degrees of stress. In the United States, shifts in public opinion, particularly among younger demographics and increasing political debate over foreign policy priorities, are seen as introducing greater complexity into what was once a relatively stable bipartisan consensus. In the regional arena, normalization is viewed as more politically sensitive than initially assumed. And in multilateral diplomacy, competing global powers are perceived as offering alternative channels of influence, contributing to a more multipolar diplomatic environment. Importantly, this interpretation does not necessarily predict a linear or uniform collapse of alliances or relationships. Rather, it describes a scenario of gradual strategic adjustment, where diplomatic relationships become more conditional, more contested domestically, and more sensitive to external shocks. Outcomes in such a system are not predetermined. They depend heavily on future political decisions, conflict dynamics, and leadership choices across multiple states. The historical analogy sometimes invoked in this type of analysis is the late-stage transformation of other internationally isolated or contested states where long-standing external pressures eventually intersected with internal political change to produce negotiated transitions. However, such comparisons are inherently imperfect. Modern geopolitical systems are more economically interconnected, more institutionally complex, and more deeply embedded in global media and financial networks than in earlier historical cases, making direct parallels only partially informative. Finally, it is worth emphasizing that scenarios involving extreme outcomes, whether deep diplomatic isolation, rapid regional realignment, or existential security crises remain speculative and contingent rather than inevitable. Strategic systems rarely move in straight lines. They respond to feedback loops, unexpected events, leadership changes, and external shocks. What can be said with more confidence is that the assumptions that once underpinned regional normalization and stable diplomatic equilibrium are now subject to greater contestation than in the recent past, and that the coming years are likely to involve continued negotiation over what the next phase of regional order will look like.